Hey everybody, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Lag in Todesbanden, which translates to Christ lay in death's bonds. Pretty interesting chorale. We looked at this particular text yesterday, and looking ahead to tomorrow, we're going to be looking at this same text again. So chances are there are some formal and harmonic similarities between all of the chorales that we will be had looked at over the span of this 3-day block of looking at this particular text. We've also looked at it in the past, but it was quite a long time ago and I don't have a direct memory. I'd need to look at the material again to refresh my memory. But we're just going to hop right into today's analysis. It's fairly straightforward. It's pretty dense, but regardless, fairly straightforward. We have one sharp in the key signature. We start on E minor. We end on E major. So I reckon the entire tonality of the chorale is E minor. However, I think we start in the key of B minor, and this E minor chord happens to be a 4 chord, and we start off with a passing tone in the tenor as well before we get E, C sharp, F sharp, and A sharp, which is F sharp 7 over E. That's a 5-4-2 chord. F sharp 7 is our dominant in the key of B minor. We then have D, D, F sharp, and B. That's our tonic triad and first inversion. That's where we would expect a 5-4-2 chord to resolve. And then we have all four of the voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here, which indicates to me that there is a subdivided chord progression going on. C sharp, E, A sharp, and C sharp spells A sharp diminished over C sharp. That's 7-6, and we know where that would go. If you've watched my videos in the past, you've seen this progression a ton. This is B. We're going to expect this to go to a tonic triad and root position, or in other words, B minor, B, F sharp, B, and D. That's exactly where it goes. And then we get B minor again on the next beat. We have B, 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 and D. This A is an accented, it's not an accented non-chord tone. It's just the material looks like that's where the beat is, but it's actually here. And what we end up getting when we take all of the voices and move it onto the beat, we have B, G, C sharp, and E. So actually this G is an accented non-chord, or I keep on calling it an accented non-chord tone. It is not an accented non-chord tone. It's happening off of the beat. But here it turns into a suspension, or something that looks like a suspension. And if we take an aggregate of all of the voices, we have B, G, C sharp, and E, which is C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over B. It's another 4-2 chord. Looking a bit similar to yesterday's chorale, we would expect this 4-2 chord to resolve to 5-6, which is what it does. A sharp, F sharp, C sharp, and E. So more specifically a 5-6-5 chord, but first inversion 5 chord nonetheless. And here we get the interesting profile that I talked about at length yesterday. B, F sharp, C sharp, and D. We could analyze that as a tonic triad with a suspension going on here in the alto, but I think what's actually happening here is this tonic triad, or what would seemingly be a tonic triad, morphs into a 6 chord as the bass changes when the alto resolves. G, B, B, and D, which is a deceptive progression, but is a turnaround in the context of the fact that we're about to cadence. So we would expect 6 to go to some type of 2 chord, which it does, E, C sharp, B, and C sharp. Interestingly enough, an incomplete 2 chord, but a 2-6-5 chord nonetheless. It's actually kind of interesting because he's omitting the 5th of the chord here, which is pretty integral to the sound of the minor 7 flat 5. There's no flat 5 in this minor 7 flat 5 chord, but that's what we would expect in a minor key, and I'm going to analyze it that way. But now that I think about it, we actually get another minor chord later, like a harmonization of melodic minor, and we end up getting 2 as a minor chord rather than a diminished chord, which makes me wonder, maybe Bach omitted the G for some reason here as well. But of course we do get G's in the measure as well. It is contrapuntal, as Bach typically is in his cadential writing, so you could analyze this as 2-6-5. Maybe you could even analyze this as 2-6-5 without the half diminished symbol. I think either way they're both accurate analyses. but this F is a non-chord tone, this E is a chord tone, it's this D right here that's a non-chord tone, this A sharp, sorry, it got printed as a B flat, but it's still a non-chord tone, and this C sharp is a chord tone as well. So that when we take the aggregate of all of those, we get F sharp 7 in root position, which is a 5-7 chord, and our perfect authentic cadence ends with this 4-3 suspension in the tenor. Regardless, it's a major triad that we end on. And this is interesting that he ends on a major triad here because it sort of foreshadows what's going to be happening next, which is E minor, and B would be the key of the minor dominant, so he cadences in major to smooth out the transition, or at least that's what I speculate. So we start off the next phrase pivoting towards the key of E minor. We get another B major chord, D sharp, B, F sharp, and B, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion. Or you could analyze this as 5 in the key of E minor and say this was a direct modulation, or say that you could modulate on the cadential chord here and say that the phrase allides with the next. I think they're all accurate analyses, but I'm going to say the modulation occurs here, and this is our 5-6 chord. I tend to analyze modulations as late as possible. It's just kind of how I've been doing it consistency-wise. But after our 5-6 chord, we have a passing 7th in the melody, and we have E, B, F sharp, and G. And what actually ends up happening here, I think, is really interesting if we draw a comparison to what happened in the previous measure. We have E, B, F sharp, and G, so we would wow, I just got tongue-tied there. We would be expecting a tonic triad here, which I think is a fair analysis if you're looking at the grand scheme of, like, where is 5 likely resolving, but I think it's too much of a coincidence to see this as, or it would be too much to pass up to the fact that it's coincidentally resolving to a 6 chord, 5-6 going to 6, just like we saw earlier, right? E, C, E, and G. So I feel like that's actually more likely what's happening here. This is a 6-6 chord, C major over E, making this B, I guess, a suspension that resolves upwards. I still have not looked up if there is a term for a suspension that resolves upwards. If you know, if you can comment that would be fantastic. But 5-6 going to 6-6, drawing a comparison to the progression we saw in the previous phrase and seeing a double suspension going on, pretty cool. We've been seeing double suspensions recently in Bach, especially in this particular text, or associated with this text. I don't think there's anything, maybe there is like a literary device that is suspension. Like, I don't know enough about creative writing to liken a musical suspension to something used in literature, but something about the double suspension in this particular chorale setting, or this family of similar chorale settings, is interesting. But after our 6 chord, we get F sharp, C, E, and A. That's F sharp minor 7 flat 5, or 2-7 in root position. Kind of cool that we get a root position 2-7 chord, not the most common configuration. Then we get these 16th notes here. F sharp, B, D sharp, and A spells 5-6-5, and I feel like that's what's likely most happening. God, I've been getting tongue-tied over the last couple of videos. Apologies. Hopefully the content is still easy or straightforward enough to follow if you are following along with your own analysis, or just watching for educational purposes. But briefly, a 5-6-5 chord does occur here. Even though it's only over 16th notes, we do have F sharp and A, which is implying, or could potentially be implying, some type of dominance. But interestingly, this isn't a 5-6-5 chord, this is a 5-4-3 chord. 5-4-3 because F sharp is in the bass. If you care about inversions when the bass is static, it would be a 5-4-3 chord. If you don't, you could just analyze this as 5. I've been in theory classes where the professor has done both. At the end of the day, there is some type of dominant chord happening here, in my opinion, so it's likely that it's happening after a 2 chord as well. The cycle of fifths progression, very normative, very straightforward. But instead of going to our tonic, we go to 3, which is kind of interesting. G, B, B, and G, B, B, and B. Oh no, that is right. G and 3 Bs. Well, that's an interesting chord. I guess technically, yeah, this is a 3 chord with 3 thirds and a root. That's pretty interesting. I have a theory of what's happening here, but let's analyze a little bit further to give it context. So we have a neighbor tone in the bass and two passing tones in the upper voices, F sharp, B, D sharp from earlier, and A. That is B7 over F sharp, another 5-4-3 chord. And 3 going to 5, not the most common progression, but somewhat used with some frequency. You know, we don't see 3 chords all that often, so when we do see a 3 chord, it's sort of a toss-up where we see it go. We have expectations in theory what it should be, or where the chord should go, but you know, we see 3 go to 5 with some regularity, so it's a fairly normative progression by Bach's standards. I think 3 is really just being used as a substitute here for 1, which is echoed on the next beat, G, B, E, and G, where, you know, 3 in root position is very similar to 1 in first inversion. So they really, in like a turnaround context where we are delaying the resolution, it can be used as a means of prolonging, right? Because the tonic isn't present, but other than the tonic not being present, the chord is more or less entirely intact and it's stable. So I would imagine that's why Bach is doing it. But after this passing tone in the bass, we get B, B, E, and F sharp. I reckon a 5 chords being implied here. This E is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and we see this pattern where we see a suspension here, and it's also echoed in the melody as well, or in one of the other voices. I feel like it's mostly the melody though, but this D sharp is our resolution. This C sharp's a lower ornament. Our fully contextualized chord happens on the next beat, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp with this late passing 7th, so we don't need to reanalyze the Roman numeral. And our perfect authentic cadence concludes with E minor in root position, E, G, B, and E. Looking ahead, we have a little quirky progression here. We're still in the key of E minor, but something very interesting, or I say very interesting. It's very interesting to me, but objectively speaking, we have seen more interesting things. But towards the end of the first system, we get a pretty interesting little progression here that I will detail when we get to it. But we end with a Phrygian half cadence. We'll go over what a Phrygian half cadence is if you're not familiar with that terminology. But we start off with an E minor chord, E, G, B, and E. No need to reanalyze because we just had an E minor chord. Sorry, there's something off frame that is keeping me from putting my hand in a comfortable writing position. I just had to scoot it over. We have passing tones in the melody as well as the tenor before we get E, B, E, and G. That's another E minor chord. We don't need to reanalyze. And we have a late passing 7th here in the bass before we get C, E, E, and A. This is the beginning of the interesting chord progression. This is A minor in first inversion. A little neighbor tone here, and then we pivot from C natural to C sharp. And what chord do we get on the other side? C sharp, A, E, and E. So the only thing that's changed is the third of the chord, and we go from 4-6 to 4-6, but 1 is major. And I think there's a way, I'm actually certain there's a way to express this in figured bass. But I'm using Roman numerals to really emphasize the fact that these chords share a Roman numeral, but their quality is different. But if I was better with figured bass, I'd be able to analyze this with, you know, I could actually probably figure out what the figured bass is. It's probably 6, and then there would be like a 3 with a sharp next to it or something, or a 5 with a sharp next to it because of the effect that the leading, or the raised third in the chord is, but I'm not going to waste too much time trying to figure that out now. Regardless, there's this, what I was calling a cross-relation pivot here, where there are two different, it's not happening in different voices like we would typically expect a false or a cross-relation to occur, like if we had C natural here and then C sharp here, but it's happening in the same voice, and we're using a pivot to change or to bridge the gap between two tones, right? It's interesting because really there isn't anything holding Bach back from just going C natural to C sharp to D sharp, right? He uses chromatic bass lines all the time where we just ascend in chromatic half steps or descend in chromatic half steps, but here this little pivot, it's unusual. Something about it is something that we don't see all that often. But what we do see relatively often is after this 4-6 chord, we see a subdivision of the harmony, where bare minimum we get the leading tone connecting to the tonic, which is what we have after a 4/6 chord in this ascending configuration. But in this case we have an actual voicing of an entire chord, D sharp, A, B, and F sharp, which is 5/6/5. Pretty common subdivided chord progression. If we don't get 5 there, we typically get 7 as a chord. And then we resolve to E minor, E, G, B, and G, which is, like I mentioned, our tonic triad. Passing 7th in the bass, this A is a non-chord tone, this C is a non-chord tone, this B and D, this D is a non-chord tone, this B is, I guess this D is part of a passing 7th figure, this B is a chord tone, and then we go to C, C, E, and A. It's A minor in first inversion, or 4/6, and then we get B major, B, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord in root position. And what makes this a Phrygian half cadence is just textbook terminology, is the fact that we have motion of a half step going down in the bass in a half cadential context. So we have the flat 6 of the scale going down to 5, and pretty much always it's a 4/6 chord going to 5. Sometimes we see 2/4/3, but when we do see 2/4/3, and there's an argument to be made that the chord is a 2/4/3, 4/6 is usually lingering in there somewhere. So the fact that we either see exclusively a 4/6 chord or sometimes a 2/4/3 chord that could be analyzed as a 4/6 chord, pretty much every time it's a 4/6 chord, and that's been my experience with the chorales so far. So until I see exclusively a 2/4/3, go to a 5 chord where we see it as plainly as this, or in a similarly direct texture where we have all the voices, not chromaticism. Well, there could be chromaticism, but no passing tones or counterpoint to otherwise blur the texture. I'm convinced that they're pretty much always 4/6 chords. But our next phrase is ended by a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor. So we're moving back to the key that we started on. And the way that we start off, I think, is still in the key of E minor. We start off with another B major chord, B, D sharp, F sharp, and B, kind of in a roundabout way, just like how we moved to E minor here, and we started the phrase off with 2 B major chords. Here we're in E minor and using those same B major chords to eventually move to B minor. So B major again, that's another 5 chord, no need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass, G, E, B, and E. That is E minor in first inversion, which is 1/6, and I think that this is where we modulate to the key of B minor, and I'm going to make a comment on this in a second, because what we have on the offbeat is passing tones here, F sharp, D and, or B and E, and then we get E and G here, which is for just a very brief moment taking the E minor chord and putting it in root position. Now what I said earlier was I tend to analyze the modulation as late as possible, and when I say this I mean regarding the harmonic rhythm. So if I analyze the modulation on the cadence to E minor here, would it have made a difference? Not really. But here, if I were to say the modulation occurred like on a 16th note in a chorale, which otherwise has a harmonic rhythm of quarter notes, it doesn't really seem all that likely, because this is, if anything, just a coincidence that we're getting the chord in root position here. And I tend to mark when that occurs because it seems to be a toss-up whether or not the moving of other voices leaves us with an entirely intact chord. Sometimes when we move the other voices we get rid of the 5th, which doesn't really matter, but to me I think it's interesting just to track that metric to see how frequently Bach does it, and it seems like it really is a toss-up. It's close to 50-50, if not leans a little bit more heavily in favor of the chord being incomplete, but regardless, that's mostly speculative, and I'm marking the modulation here because this is the point in the harmonic rhythm, like on the harmonic rhythm, where I think the modulation occurs. So after 4/6, we get a pretty interesting progression here. This is an unusual one. We get F sharp, C, A, and D. This is F sharp, A, and D. I'm really bad at reading sometimes, y'all. It makes me worry that sometimes my analyses are inaccurate, but I do usually catch myself, and I have my notes to refer back to, so if there are any corrections that you are very confident about, please share them in the comments. It helps strengthen the analysis for everyone who's watching the video, and I'll pin your comment and everything to make sure it stays at the top of the comments list. But this is a D major chord, and in a very similar fashion to what we saw earlier, we saw a chord that would unlikely go to 3, and I'd say 5 going to 3 might be a little bit more likely than 4 going to 3, but effectively they're both moving in a similar fashion. That is to say that if 4 would be going to 1, which is typically where we would expect it to go, right? We would expect 4 to go to 1 in this context. If we saw F sharp and D, we would expect the inner voices to be Bs, right? But they're both As. So our expectations are not met. In the same way that 5 we would expect to go to 1, right? This F sharp and this A, or sorry, this F sharp and this B, and the other voices would be Ds, but they're not. So it's interesting that we see that here again, just a different roundabout way. 3 from the other side of the cycle of fifths. So this is a 3/6 chord, and this A and this F sharp here kind of take the chord and put it in second inversion. And I don't really know how consequential that is. It probably isn't. It's just similar to what we have here. The chord is entirely intact, so I will mark it, but do take with a grain of salt the fact that it is happening on an offbeat, and it doesn't really have as much of an impact on whether or not this is like a 6/4 chord in a configuration that we would expect, like in a passing context or in a pedal context like the textbook would suggest, which is generally pretty straight on, like dead on, accurate as far as the general trends of how the chords operate are concerned. But after our 3/6 chord, we end up going back to 4, G sharp, B, B, and E. So we are hearkening back to this pivot, this cross relation pivot, like I was calling it, where we have, in this case, we have D versus, wait, am I analyzing that correct? We have G natural in one of the voices. Yes, we have G natural here, right? G natural's in the E minor that we have here, and we have G sharp here. So in a roundabout way, if we redacted all of the ornamentation, we have G natural, F sharp, and G sharp, which is really just a more ornamented variation of what we see here in the bass in the previous measure, or the previous phrase. So this is just another 4/6 chord. This time it is major though, rather than minor. So that was the big takeaway. Sorry I used so many words to mention it, but this C sharp is not a chord tone. This E is a chord tone. This G sharp is a chord tone. So what this C sharp does, and because 3 voices are moving off of the harmonic rhythm, I'll use an arrow here so that we don't get too scrunched. We actually get the minor 2 chord, C sharp, E, G sharp, and E in root position. And 4 going to 2, remember this is a subdivided chord progression, right? 4 going to 2, not really a progression in the same way that other chord progressions are, because 2 and 4, they pretty much function the same, and they're mostly consisting of the same tones, so really the chords are very similar to one another. The only difference between them is C sharp versus B, right? So they're very similar to one another. You could even make the argument that this is a big 2 chord if you wanted to omit this, or if you just wanted to take everything of what was going on this beat together. But the reason why I feel like this 2 chord is significant is because a 5 chord follows it, and typically we expect 2 to go to 5. We also expect 4 to go to 5, so all in all, it's not super important that we have this subdivided chord progression here. I just feel like from a textural standpoint, Bach has been doing a lot of subdividing where the bass is moving a lot, and it just so happens to be changing the spelling of the chords, sometimes changing the structure of the chord completely. So that's why I feel compelled to mark it. I don't think it needs to be marked as in such a granular fashion that I did, but you can do so as well. You know, take however much of the analysis you feel you need for your own personal reasons. But after our 2 chord or our 4/6 chord, or however you reason the aggregate of this entire beat, we get A sharp, C sharp, C sharp, and F sharp. That is F sharp major over A sharp, which is 5/6. And this F is a chord tone, this B is a little passing tone, and this E is a passing 7th. You could even make the argument that there is an entirely intact 7 chord here. Maybe I'll mark that because Bach has been subdividing a lot, and seems like he pretty much spent the whole measure subdividing each beat with either an inversion or a brand new chord. So yeah, so 7/5/3 versus 5/6, and we would expect that to resolve to a tonic triad, right? Well, not exactly, because if we remember our first phrase, we're going to see this very similar suspension here where we have C sharp being held over, but by the time it resolves, we get G natural in the bass, G, D, B, and D. 6 chord root position. So it's a deceptive progression after all of that, and really does just reference back to the first introduction to the cadence of the first phrase. And after our 6 chord, we know likely where this is going to go, because chances are it is going to follow the same structure as the first phrase. And I added this 1 here because if you see it as a 1 chord that then goes to 6, that's fine. I don't see it that way. I hear it as a 6 chord, but like I said, it's entirely up to you and based on the way that you hear it. But we have E, G, B, and C sharp. That's 2/6/5. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords in cadential contexts. This F sharp is a non-chord tone, this F sharp is a non-chord tone, this A sharp is a non-chord tone, this C sharp, when we take all of those together, it gives us a 5 chord, and then we cadence on B minor, B, D, F sharp, and B, tonic triad, root position. Now this phrase right here I think is the most interesting phrase in the whole chorale. We end in a half cadence in the key of D major, and where I do think there's an argument to be made that we spend the entire time in the key of D major, I think we move to the key of G major to then get to the key of D major. So we have a mid-phrase modulation where we modulate to a key that we don't end the phrase in. And when I talk about mid-phrase modulations, that's what I mean. I don't mean that, technically speaking, we get a mid-phrase being the fact that we don't spend the whole phrase in the key of E minor. We use a common chord even from the very start, mid-phrase. Or here, mid-phrase, we don't spend the whole time in B minor, we spend most of it. Here, we go to G major, and then we go to D major, so there's actually 2 modulations that are occurring here, and when that's the case, that's what I mean by mid-phrase modulation, is that there's more than one modulation that occurs, and the phrase ends. Typically, it ends in a different key than we started the phrase in. So, we have an interesting progression here to start things off, because we have some cross relations immediately going on, or another one of these cross relation pivots, but it's not quite the same as this one here. We start off with C sharp diminished, and I'm not really I don't really, there's no reason for me to believe that we've modulated yet. It sounds like we're going to be going to the key of D major for some reason because C sharp resolves up to D, but if we see a C sharp diminished chord, especially in first inversion, I might be inclined to think that we're going to an F sharp major chord in the key of B minor. So I think this is actually a 2/6 chord here. And if you saw this introduction here as a brief modulation to D major or a tonicization of D major, you could analyze this as 7/6 of 3 or 7/6 of 5, depending on if you think we're going to G major, which I do. But I think the analysis might be a little bit more straightforward than this. So here, D major is D, A, F sharp, and D, which I think is our 3 chord, right? We just have 1, 2, 3. Kind of an interesting progression, right? Just adjacent harmony, which is kind of rare, but 2/6 is kind of like a 4 chord going to 3, the same way that we saw earlier, because the 4 of the scale is in the bass, and then we get a root position 3 chord. But with this C natural here, it's pretty clear that we're moving to the realm of G major, because we have C naturals throughout. All of the C sharps that we had from B minor before are pretty much gone because we're moving to the key of G major. And it makes sense that we would be going to G major in the grand scheme of things, because G major is closer in relationship to E minor than B minor is. But what takes us back off the beaten path and breaks that logic is the fact that we end the phrase in D major. So this 3 chord turns into 5, and this passing 7th here is indicative of that. If this was a passing C sharp, then we might still be in the key of B minor. We might even be in the key of D major, but actually we probably would be in the key of D major now that I think about it. But after our 5 chord, we get G major, G, B, D, and B, which is our tonic triad, and I just realized I wrote D major here and not G major. 5 going to 1, that makes more sense. We have 3 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here, A, D, and C. It's like another D7 chord, but it's not entirely intact, no F sharp, so I'm not going to mark it. We then have B, G, D, and D, which is G major in first inversion. That's a 1/6 chord. We'll just write the figured bass. Another passing tone in the bass here before we get D, G, D, and A. This G is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and we know that 5 is being implied. And coincidentally, I do think this 5 chord is where we are going to go to the key of D major, D, B, E, and G. I don't think this is E minor 7 over D. I think this D is a lower suspension. Maybe it is a 9/10 suspension under the alto, or a, what would that be? No, probably not under the melody. It's probably under the alto if it was being analyzed, because that would be like an 11/12 suspension, but the 12 would be diminished, so not really much of a resolution there. But C sharp, B, E, and G does make sense. That's C sharp minor 7 flat 5. Remember, the B is natural here, so it would be a 7/7 chord with the half diminished sign. And then we get taken to D major, D, A, E, and F. This E is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Bach loves the 9/8 suspension over D chords. We've been seeing it a lot in D minor. Here we're seeing it in D major. So this is an implied 1 chord, and by the time we get the resolution, we get 1/6, F sharp, A, D, and A. You could even go as far as to say that this is just a 1/6 chord, the same way that I was calling this a 6 chord, right? If the resolution isn't actually being implied. But I feel like really, because all the voices are moving here, this is a little bit stronger of a gesture than this. But ultimately speaking, we do cadence on 5, which is A major. And in a roundabout way, we end up cadencing on A major, which is a common chord to the next key, which is E minor. And you might be thinking, why is A major a common chord to the key of E minor? We would be expecting an A minor chord. Well, if you harmonize the melodic minor scale, which is what's happening here, C sharp, D sharp, E, we get a major 4 chord, just like we've seen earlier in these cases right here, one by my ring finger and one by the tip of my pencil. So after a 4 chord, we would expect probably a dominant functioning chord, especially when it's major like this. Sometimes we get a subtonic 7th, that's true, but most of the time we get a dominant functioning chord. And here we have A, B, D sharp, and B. Another one of these incomplete chords, but still what's being implied is 5, 4, 2, and we would expect that to resolve to 1/6, which it does, G, B, E, and B. We typically expect 4, 2 chords to resolve. The root resolves a 5th below, so 5 going to 1, 6 going to 2, etc. And in first inversion, because the 7th of the chord typically resolves down by step, not always, but the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time it does, which would leave us with a 1/6 chord. But after our 1/6 chord, we are getting several more subdivisions. This is a very harmonically dense phrase just by virtue of the fact that the bass is moving a lot as well as the other voices, and it's a short phrase. So here we have G, C sharp, E, and A. That's another A7 chord here. I'm going to, actually, you know what? I'm going to use arrows for the offbeats here moving forward. So we have A7 over G. It's another 4/2 chord. Here it's 4/4/2. We would expect this to go to 7/6, right? Because 7 is a 5th below 4, and in first inversion, because that's where the 7th is resolving, this F sharp is a known chord tone, this D sharp is a known chord tone, this F sharp is a known chord tone, this A here, that leaves us with D sharp diminished over F sharp, which is 7/6. So as you can see, the chords typically resolve the way that you would expect them to in theory. And then afterwards we get E minor, 4 going to 7 going to 1, probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of Bach. And when I say subdivided, I mean 2 chords that are happening, or just multiple chords happening over the span of 1 beat, or one beat of the harmonic rhythm, that is, E, E, B, and G, tonic triad, root position. And then we get C here, which is a non-chord tone. G and E are both chord tones, so we get a 6 chord here. We've seen 6 in cadential contexts before in this chorale, twice more specifically, right? We saw one here and we saw one here. And I guess you could make an argument that we've seen it 3 times because the first section repeats. But after our 6 chord, we get A, C, E, and F sharp. After a 6 chord, we typically do expect a 2 chord. This is 2, 6, 5. And we know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords in cadential situations especially. And then we have B, which is a non-chord tone as well. This A is a chord tone. This D is a non-chord tone as well. This gives us, or more specifically, D sharp from the beginning of the phrase, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, B major, and then we cadence on E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is a tonic triad in root position. I just realized to be consistent with the rest of the measure, I'm going to go and do this. And don't be confused by my use of arrows here. If you watch some of my older videos, you won't see me using arrows. This is more of a recent thing, and it just has to do with the size of the page and how much real estate I have to write. The arrows are just indicating where they go, and they occupy less space than the actual chord does, so I can bring them down a level, which makes it easier for me to write more of a spaced out fashion. But we do end the chorale on a major chord, and that is something that is typical of Bach with minor chorales. The vast majority of the time he'll end with that major quality triad. I think it just has to do with their relationship with major chords and how they have more of a finality, a stronger ending power. It could also be just because he wants to end on a more uplifting note. Who knows? Either way, he does it a lot in the minor chorales. But other than that, just a couple of things to talk about at the end. These pivots are pretty cool. We saw it kind of in 2 different ways here. We saw 4-6 going to 4-6 here. It just so happens that we get like a full 3 chord here. But I do liken what we have going on in this phrase here to what's going on here, just over a longer period of time and with more harmonic activity. We also have this interesting modulation here, right? 1, 2, 3, very unusual chord progression. I think there are other ways that you can go about analyzing this. I talked about them when this was what we were, covering in the video. But, if you feel like this whole phrase is in D major, if you feel like this whole phrase is in G major and it modulates later or earlier, this is an unusual phrase, and if you listen to it, it feels like the phrase is shortened because the cadence feels like it kind of hits you out of nowhere. It has a very unique profile, and there's a reason behind that, because the chords aren't typically what you would expect. Whether this is a secondary dominant in the key of G major or whether we're still in B minor, I analyzed it the way that I did. I think it makes sense. You might have another way, and at the end of the day, that's what matters. It's fine. They're probably both accurate if they follow that line of thinking. I just want to provide an alternative outlook. Other than that, I think that is everything that I wanted to talk about. I think that pretty much covers everything. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could hit the notification icon as well if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and you could like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that more people are going to see my content, and that is very helpful for me as a content creator. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.